Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
I'm Zara.
It's a public holiday today across the country, following on from January 26, Australia's National Day yesterday. But 20% of TDA readers don't actually know why Australia Day is held on the 26th of January, according to a recent poll of our audience. Today, we're taking a closer look at the history of January 26, its protests and celebrations, and how workplaces are shifting in response to this public holiday.
Now, lots of countries, as well as Australia, have a national day. In the US, it's July 4th. In New Zealand, it's Waitangi Day. And here in Australia, it's Australia Day, which, as you just said, is held on January 26. I think a good place to start is by just understanding what the day is meant to be about here in Australia.
So Australia has this national public holiday on the 26th of January because that is the anniversary of the day we think the First Fleet arrived in 1788. Now, the First Fleet, of course, is the collection of ships sent from Britain to set up a colony, including famously a prison, on the land of the Gadigal people in what's now Sydney's Circular Quay. So since then, different celebrations and protests have been held commemorating the arrival of the First Fleet, which marked the beginning of British colonisation. But it wasn't until relatively recently that the date of the 26th of January was set aside as a national public holiday in all states and territories.
We'll get to the discussion of a public holiday in just a moment, but I do just want to go back to that date, 26th of January, 1788, obviously a very long time ago. What else do we know about that specific day and about what happened when the First Fleet sailed into Sydney?
Yeah, so we do have some first-hand accounts from sailors who were on ships in the First Fleet. I'm going to read out a little excerpt from an account of the English colony of New South Wales by David Collins. He is a man who worked under Governor Phillip. It says, in the course of the day, the 26th, sufficient ground was cleared for camping. In the evening of this day, a flagstaff was purposely erected and a Union Jack displayed. Another first-hand account, this one from a man called Daniel Southwell, who travelled with the First Fleet, has a different description of the arrival. Southwell says that as the ships came into the harbour, First Nations people were visible on the shore, quote, brandishing their spears as though to dispute our passage, and that they seemed frantic and agitated.
Now, a public holiday in the year of 2025 feels a very long way away from those descriptions of the day over 230 years ago. Can you just take me through some of the history of the day, January 26, since the 1780s?
Yeah, so one of the biggest events to have taken place on the 26th of January was 50 years later in 1838. And that's when in northern New South Wales, police and settlers killed at least 40 Gamilaroi people in what's known as the Waterloo Creek Massacre. This massacre is just one in a series of violent attacks and clashes at that time known as the Frontier Wars. So those wars began in 1788 and continued well into the 20th century, where British settlers would violently advance the colony across the country from the east, and First Nations people resisted. This is the Frontier Wars, and it's estimated as much as 90% of the pre-colonisation population of First Peoples in Australia was killed during these wars. In 2020, Gamilaroi elder Polly Cutmore told the ABC, the trauma continues on.
I think a lot of the time this conversation, the national conversation about whether this is a day of mourning or a day of celebration has been framed as a new conversation, or that it's, this kind of social media-led conversation. Clearly, from what you have said, this day has for a very long time had very different meanings to different groups of people in this country. When did we, though, start seeing more organised demonstrations, especially from First Nations communities here in Australia?
Yes, so dating back as far as 1888, there were celebrations across the country. So that was marking the 100th anniversary of the First Fleet's arrival. But Wiradjuri writer Dr. Anita Heiss has said there were even boycotts of celebrations by First Nations people even then.
So in 1888?
Yeah. A little bit later, on the 150th anniversary in 1938, there was a reenactment of the First Fleet's arrival in which First Nations men were forced to perform in this reenactment. And there are accounts from their descendants, which have been reported by the ABC, which indicate these men were traumatised by that reenactment experience for the rest of their lives. On the same day, there was a major First Nations-led demonstration in Sydney called a Day of Mourning and Protest. And I suppose this could kind of be seen as the turning point in the mainstream protests that we see today. Yorta Yorta man and civil rights activist Jack Patton told attendees on that day in 1938, "On this day, the white people are rejoicing, but we have no reason to rejoice. This land belonged to our forefathers 150 years ago, but today we are pushed further and further into the background." So that is a representation of a First Nations perspective dating back to 1938.
So much of the conversation is about whether the date should be marked as a public holiday or not. We obviously have just heard about the significance of the day for First Nations communities here, but it is fairly recent that January 26 became Australia Day, a public holiday.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is something that still surprises people when they learn. But different states and territories had introduced public holidays around the 26th of January from 1938 and throughout the 1900s, but it didn't become a formal national public holiday until 1994, so 31 years ago, basically. The 26th, though, was yesterday, we should mention.
Yeah.
And the reason that today is a public holiday is if the 26th falls on a Saturday or Sunday, we get a long weekend. So today, yes, is the 27th, but technically it's a day in lieu public holiday. Interestingly, though, many of our listeners might not actually be taking today off. According to a survey we conducted last year, out of 15,000 respondents, 75% said employers should give workers a choice about whether or not to work on Jan 26 or the public holiday. Nearly half said their employer had already given them the option to take another day off instead.
Always a lot of reporting on whether or not companies will allow their employees to do this. And obviously private companies, that's up to their discretion, but an interesting conversation nonetheless. Let's turn now to yesterday. How was January 26 marked around the country?
Yeah, a very different and diverse set of experiences on the schedule yesterday. Thousands and thousands of people turned out right across the country for Invasion Day rallies. There were marches in capital cities and in major regional centres. At the same time as those marches were going on, there were 750 community events across all states and territories, which had received federal funding to support their Jan 26 programs. The government said that more than 171 of those events had significant Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander elements. It was also a big day, as Jan 26 always is, for those people becoming Australian citizens. So Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was in Canberra for the annual National Citizenship and Flag Raising ceremony, and that's where we saw Governor-General Sam Mostyn lead a ceremony called the Australian Citizenship Affirmation, welcoming Australia's newest citizens. That was just one of over 380 ceremonies held across the country yesterday, where more than 20,600 people from over 150 countries were expected to attend and officially become Australian citizens.
Em, I don't think we can end this conversation without touching on the push to change the date. Every year around this time, there is a national discussion about whether or not Jan 26 is the appropriate date based on the things that were mentioned earlier. Where are we at with that movement? Is there going to be in Australia's future a time where the date is changed?
This is really interesting because I think the discourse a couple of years ago felt as though it was moving one way. But some recent polling by Resolve Strategic for 9 newspapers actually indicates things might be shifting the other way. So this polling found support for keeping our National Day on January 26 has actually increased. So in 2023, this 9 newspapers poll found that 47% of respondents supported Australia Day remaining on January 26. Now we're 2 years later and that number has increased to 61%. So from 47 to 61 in 2 years. Yeah. Interestingly, though, the number of Australians who said they were either neutral or unsure has held really quite steady at around 15%. So no change in the middle there, but either side has moved. The survey also found that 52% of voters are in favour of federal legislation to make January 26 the official day. And this is an issue that's shaping up to be one of Peter Dutton's key proposals going into this year's federal election as opposition leader. So I think we can expect to probably hear a lot more about the Australia Day debate, about the January 26 conversation over coming months. And as always, we will keep you posted.
Em, thanks for taking us through that. And thank you for joining us for another episode of The Daily Aus. Take care of yourselves today, and we'll be back again tomorrow.